Vladimir Putin has warned that if the US begins producing new short and medium-range missile systems, Russia will respond by developing its own. It follows the collapse of the landmark INF arms treaty between the two countries on Friday, which had been in effect since 1987.
If we receive verified information that the US has finished developing and started producing these systems, Russia will be forced to begin its own full-scale development of similar missiles.
It's making another signal that what we're witnessing right now are the immediate effects of Washington's official steps to withdraw from the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. America's jumping straight into action, and that leads to concerns in different parts of the world. But in the build-up to this, for months, Moscow kept saying that the collapse of the treaty is something that's very dangerous, that it's part of a bigger plan by Washington, and also that America, why it's accusing Russia of violations, is only to use these accusations as a pretext for its own military expansion when their hands are untied. And there you have it. Now the Kremlin is warning when Russia sees that something is cooking, even though it's happening in a different part of the world, the Asia-Pacific or Australia, that if they're doing it, we're going to do it too. Although Vladimir Putin is saying that Russia's current military capabilities are enough to protect the country from a potential U.S. military threat.
Let's just pick up on something you said there earlier. The U.S. Defense Secretary recently announced that the Pentagon plans to deploy short and intermediate range missiles in the Asia-Pacific region. What more do we know about that? Because it could be very significant at this stage.
Well, that's basically part of what Russia is responding to. And it's very important because the announcement by the U.S. Secretary of Defense came only 48 hours after, or even less than that, when America said that they were officially withdrawing. So I just want to show you what exactly the top man at the Pentagon said about their deployment plans.
It's fair to say, though, that we would like to deploy capabilities sooner rather than later. I would prefer months. I just don't have the latest state of play and timelines.
So again, in terms of how quickly America is acting, that is swift. And here we don't need deep analysis to figure out why they're choosing that region, because from the onset, American officials weren't even trying to hide the fact that one of the reasons why they were withdrawing from the INF treaty was because China wasn't part of it. So Beijing didn't have to limit its arsenal. America did. Now that America is quitting, problem solved. Again, going back to what the U.S. Secretary of Defense was saying, he's hoping that this kind of deployment in the region could happen within the next few months, although he's admitting that the process is lengthy. Now, what Washington is up to right now is probably giving some explanations and making some arrangements with the allies in the region. So that explains why both the U.S. Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State flew over to that region. In fact, they were in Australia, and this is where Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said this.
I think our efforts to deploy our resources, our defense resources, to create deterrence and stability around the world are something we're always looking at.
But that was followed by questions by Australian journalists, which actually point to concerns in that country over this potential deployment. They're worried that it could happen near the city of Darwin, where there's already a U.S. military base with at least 1,000 American Marines. Well, the Australian PM said that this wasn't in the plans of their government at that time.
Has the US ever asked to install missiles in Northern Australia?
No.
Would you consider it if they did ask?
It's not something the government consider. It's not being asked of us. It's not being considered. It's not being put to us. So, you know, I think I can rule a line under that.
So it looks like Australia really doesn't want to get dragged into this conflict between Beijing and Washington, even though for now it's only a threat. It's only a potential conflict. And nobody else in the region wants an arms race in their backyard, and this explains the growing media attention to it. And there will definitely be those right now who are going to question the U.S. narrative that it is China that is acting as a destabilizing force in the region.
Just tell us a little bit more about a name I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot more about, the new U.S. Defense Secretary, Mark Esper. What can we expect from him
Well, this story becomes even more fascinating if we look at his background. And this is something that came into the spotlight during his confirmation hearing that happened only about a month ago. And back then, he was being grilled by a Senate official because of his ties with a top U.S. military contractor. He has a reputation of a top lobbyist for Raytheon. So let's look at the part of the hearing where this all came to light.
Secretary Esper, prior to becoming Army Secretary, you were the top lobbyist for Raytheon. That's a conflict of interest given that Raytheon does billions of dollars worth of business every year with the Defense Department. When you left as their top lobbyist was at least $1 million in deferred compensation. This smacks of corruption. Plain and simple.
I think this is a good debate.
No, I'm not trying to have a debate.
No, I know, but I'm trying to
know, will you commit not to work for or get paid by any defense contractor for at least 4 years after your government service?
No, Senator, I will not.
These concerns, though, didn't lead to anything, and he was appointed U.S. Secretary of Defense, and we cannot make any direct links here, but as you can see, now that he's become the chief of Pentagon, it looks like the U.S. military-industrial complex is up for new contracts.
Well, I got some more reaction on this from the Executive Director of the British-American Security Information Council, that's Paul Ingram. Paul is of the view that America's decision to shift its focus to China could cause tensions with its own allies.
There is a serious problem with the way the Americans seem to be switching their attention on China. The Americans are testing the water. They're trying to encourage allies, not just in Southeast Asia, but even in Europe, to see China as the principal threat to American interests and the interests of their allies. And there's a lot of skepticism amongst allies, not least because China is a significant trading partner of all American allies. And I don't think there is the same appetite amongst allies to stir things up and to challenge the rise of China. We are some way away from knowing whether US allies will just choose to cooperate with the Americans or whether they will try to mitigate the worst excesses.